Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most shocking, heartbreaking, and infuriating cases of police failure you'll ever hear. Rachel Morningstar Hoffman was a bright and free-spirited young woman born on December 17th, 1984 in Clearwater, Florida. Her friends and family often described her as a lively, compassionate, and outgoing person who brought positivity into the lives of everyone she met. She had a warm smile and an infectious laugh that could light up any room. Rachel grew up in a loving household with her parents, Margie Weiss and Irv Hoffman. Her upbringing was filled with encouragement, and she was known for her creativity, curiosity, and zest for life. Growing up, Rachel developed a deep passion for music and cooking, hobbies that she carried with her into adulthood. Her culinary skills were impressive. She loved experimenting with new recipes and sharing meals with her friends. She attended Florida State University, FSU, in Tallahassee, where she pursued a degree in psychology. Rachel had a genuine interest in understanding people and helping others. Her dream was to use her education to support those struggling with mental health issues, particularly young. She planned to continue her education in graduate school and was on track to build a meaningful and impactful career. In addition to her studies, Rachel was a typical college student who loved socializing, attending concerts, and enjoying the freedoms of young adulthood. Like many in her age group, she occasionally smoked marijuana recreationally and sold small amounts to close friends. While this wasn't the smartest decision, it wasn't unusual behavior for college students. Rachel was not involved in any serious criminal activity or violent behavior. She was just a young woman navigating life. Rachel had a reputation for being deeply empathetic. She was the kind of person who would listen to her friends for hours if they needed someone to talk to. Her generosity extended to everyone she met. She often went out of her way to help others, whether it was offering advice, cooking a meal, or just being there for someone in need. Despite her friendly and loving nature, Rachel was also independent and free-spirited. She didn't always follow the rules to the letter, which sometimes put her at odds with authority. This rebellious streak, while part of her charm, unfortunately became a factor in the series of events that led to her tragic demise. At the time of her death, Rachel had just graduated from FSU and was preparing for the next chapter of her life. She had a bright future ahead of her, filled with promise, ambition, and dreams. However, her life was tragically cut short because of a series of reckless decisions made by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Rachel Hoffman wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a daughter, a friend, and a young woman full of potential. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when systemic failures occur, but it also underscores the importance of remembering her as more than just a tragic headline. Rachel was a vibrant individual with so much to give to the world, and her legacy lives on through the fight for justice and reform in her name. Rachel Hoffman's arrest was the pivotal event that set in motion the tragic chain of events leading to her untimely death. In 2008, Rachel was living in Tallahassee, Florida, having recently graduated from Florida State University with a degree in psychology. Like many college students, she enjoyed recreational marijuana use and occasionally sold small amounts to her friends. While her actions weren't legal, they were far from being part of any significant criminal enterprise. However, things took a turn for the worse in April 2008 when Rachel's casual marijuana use put her directly in the crosshairs of law enforcement. During a routine traffic stop, police found a small amount of marijuana and some pills without a prescription in Rachel's possession. The discovery was enough for the Tallahassee Police Department, TPD, to arrest her and potentially file felony charges against her. Here's where things got complicated. Rachel already had a prior misdemeanor charge for marijuana possession on her record. This prior arrest put her in a vulnerable position, as she was now facing much harsher penalties for her second offense. Police warned Rachel that she could face serious consequences, potentially years in prison if convicted. The prospect of a criminal record, prison time, and a damaged future was terrifying for Rachel, who had just graduated and was preparing to move on to the next phase of her life. The Tallahassee Police Department saw an opportunity to use Rachel's legal troubles to their advantage. They presented her with a stark ultimatum: either cooperate with them as a confidential informant, CI, in a drug sting operation, or face the full weight of the legal system. In other words, Rachel could either risk her safety to assist the police in targeting bigger drug dealers or be prosecuted, potentially spend years behind bars. Rachel, like many people in her position, felt trapped. She was terrified of the consequences of a criminal conviction, losing her freedom, her reputation, and her dreams for the future. Desperate to avoid jail time and seeing no other viable option, Rachel reluctantly agreed to cooperate with the police as an informant. She likely assumed that law enforcement would have her back and ensure her safety during the process. What Rachel didn't know at the time was that her decision to cooperate would place her in a situation far more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered. She had no prior experience dealing with criminals or participating in undercover operations, and the police provided her with little to no training or preparation. It was a reckless move on their part to put someone like Rachel, a young woman with no ties to organized crime, into such a perilous situation. To make matters worse, Rachel's arrest and agreement to become an informant were handled in a manner that prioritized the goals of the police department over her safety. The pressure they applied to coerce her cooperation reflected a deeply flawed system that often uses vulnerable individuals as disposable tools in the war on drugs. At the time of her arrest, Rachel likely believed she was making the best decision to protect her future. She couldn't have foreseen that the very people who were supposed to protect her would ultimately fail her so catastrophically. Her arrest marked the beginning of a series of reckless and irresponsible decisions by law enforcement that would cost Rachel her life and leave a lasting stain on the reputation of the Tallahassee Police Department. This moment, seemingly minor at first glance, became the turning point in Rachel's life, a decision made under duress that ultimately led to her tragic and preventable death. The sting operation that ultimately led to Rachel Hoffman's death stands as one of the most reckless and poorly managed undercover operations in law enforcement history. After coercing Rachel into becoming a confidential informant to avoid felony charges, the Tallahassee Police Department, TPD, devised a plan that would send her into a high-stakes, dangerous drug buy with two known, seasoned criminals. This plan was not only risky, but utterly inappropriate for an untrained civilian like Rachel. Rachel's assignment was to pose as a buyer and purchase $13,000 worth of cocaine, MDMA ecstasy, and a firearm from two suspects, Andrea Green and Danilo Bradshaw. These were not small-time drug dealers. They were dangerous individuals with violent criminal histories. Yet the TPD thought it was reasonable to send a young, inexperienced woman into such a situation without adequate protection or preparation. Rachel had no training, no knowledge of how to handle herself in an undercover capacity, and no understanding of the risks involved in dealing with armed drug dealers. The operation itself was flawed from the very beginning. First and foremost, law enforcement's decision to involve Rachel at all was a massive error. Confidential informants, CIs, are typically used in low-level investigations or carefully monitored operations, but Rachel was tasked with infiltrating a large-scale drug deal involving dangerous criminals. She was not a professional undercover officer, yet she was being sent into a scenario more suited for a seasoned veteran of law enforcement. The police provided Rachel with $13,000 in cash to make the drug and firearm purchase. However, they equipped her with little to no meaningful protection. Rachel's only form of surveillance was a listening device placed in her purse, which would allow officers to monitor her conversations during the sting. There were no hidden cameras, no GPS trackers, and no panic button or emergency protocols in case things went wrong. Rachel was essentially being sent into a lion's den with nothing but a wire and the vague promise that the police were watching her back. On May 7, 2008, the day of the operation, Rachel met the two dealers at a prearranged location. Almost immediately, the situation began to unravel. Green and Bradshaw became suspicious of Rachel and her intentions. Sensing something was off, the two men decided to change the meeting location, instructing Rachel to drive them to a more remote and secluded area in the rural outskirts of Tallahassee. This change of plan should have raised major red flags for law enforcement, yet incredibly, the police failed to intervene. As Rachel drove the suspects to the new location, the TPD lost contact with her. This was partly because her wire was in her purse and not on her person, meaning her voice often went in and out of range. Additionally, the officers were not actively tailing her vehicle. That was one of my major questions for you. They had positioned themselves too far away to effectively monitor her movements or provide immediate backup. For reasons that remain baffling, they allowed Rachel and the suspects to leave without any direct surveillance, even as the situation grew more precarious by the minute. In hindsight, the sting was doomed from the moment the suspects demanded to change locations. Rachel's safety should have been the top priority, and the operation should have been called off as soon as things began to deviate from the original plan, but instead of stepping in to protect her, the police let her continue, effectively abandoning her in a life-threatening situation. Once they reached the remote area, Green and Bradshaw's suspicions turned into certainty. They realized Rachel was working with them. What happened next was horrifying. The two men turned on Rachel, murdered her in cold blood, and left her body in a ditch. She'd been shot multiple times. The $13,000 in cash and her possessions were stolen. By the time the police realized they had lost her and began searching, it was already far too late. This sting operation was riddled with mistakes, from the lack of proper planning to the complete absence of safeguards for Rachel's protection. Sending an untrained young woman to purchase drugs and a firearm from dangerous felons was a reckless and irresponsible decision that directly contributed to her death. The sting was a textbook example of how not to conduct a law enforcement operation. Rachel Hoffman trusted the police to protect her, and they failed her in every possible way. Their decisions reflected not only incompetence, but also a lack of regard for Rachel's life. And her death was not an unfortunate accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a poorly conceived, grossly negligent operation. In the aftermath, the failure of this operation sparked outrage and calls for accountability, highlighting the urgent need for reform in how confidential informants are utilized and protected. Rachel's case became a tragic example of what happens when law enforcement prioritizes results over the safety of the people they involve. The lack of protection provided to Rachel Hoffman during the sting operation was a glaring and catastrophic failure on the part of the Tallahassee Police Department, TPD. From the moment Rachel was recruited as a confidential informant, CI, her safety and well-being were given shockingly little consideration, even though she was being asked to participate in a high-risk operation that would expose her to significant danger. Confidential informants are supposed to be protected at every step of an operation, especially when they are civilians with no training or experience. However, in Rachel's case, basic safety protocols were either ignored or completely overlooked. The TPD's reckless disregard for Rachel's life became evident in how they planned and executed the sting operation. Rachel was a 23-year-old recent college graduate with no law enforcement experience or undercover training. Yet, she was expected to pose as a drug buyer in a deal involving $13,000 worth of cocaine, ecstasy, and a firearm, a transaction with violent and dangerous criminals. She had no idea how to handle herself in such a situation, no understanding of how to read the behavior of the suspects, and no real grasp of the risks she was taking. Despite this, the police gave her no training, no guidance on how to conduct the deal, and no preparation for what to do if things went wrong. She was essentially thrown into the operation blind, with no tools or skills to protect herself. The only surveillance equipment Rachel was provided with was a listening device placed inside her purse. While this wire was intended to allow officers to monitor the conversation during the drug deal, it was an inadequate form of protection for several reasons. Poor placement. The wire was in her purse, not on her person, meaning the audio was often muffled or cut out entirely when Rachel moved or shifted her position. No backup visuals. There were no cameras or visual surveillance to track Rachel's movements or provide law enforcement with a clear picture of what was happening. No GPS tracker. Rachel's car wasn't outfitted with a GPS tracker, making it impossible for officers to locate her when the operation started to go off course. In an operation involving armed suspects and a large amount of cash, This bare minimum level of surveillance was grossly insufficient. Perhaps the most egregious failure was the police's inability to maintain real-time contact with Rachel during the operation. When the suspects, Andrea Green and Danilo Bradshaw, changed the meeting location and instructed Rachel to drive them to a rural area outside Tallahassee, the TPD lost track of her entirely. The officers were stationed too far away to effectively follow her vehicle. The audio from her wire became unreliable as she drove to the remote location. There was no plan in place to immediately intervene if things went wrong. And this lack of real-time monitoring left Rachel completely alone with two dangerous men who were becoming increasingly suspicious of her intentions. The moment the suspects changed the meeting location, the TPD should have recognized that the situation was spiraling out of control. Change in location is a common tactic used by criminals to test whether someone is being watched or working with law enforcement. Yeah, most people say Rachel wasn't a crazy person, but I think they just wanted to believe that she was. This move should have been a massive red flag, but instead of calling off the operation and extracting Rachel, the police allowed her to continue without any backup or intervention. This decision left her completely vulnerable. One of the most shocking aspects of the operation was the lack of physical backup in Rachel's immediate vicinity. The officers assigned to monitor the sting were stationed far away from the initial meeting location and were not actively following Rachel's car when she drove off with the suspects. This meant that when Green and Bradshaw changed locations, the police were completely unable to respond or track her movements. Rachel was left utterly alone in a situation that was growing more perilous by the minute. Ultimately, the TPD's decisions reflect a complete disregard for Rachel's safety. By sending an untrained civilian into such a dangerous situation with no meaningful protection, they treated her as expendable, a tool to be used in their pursuit of larger criminal targets. Rachel trusted the police to look out for her, but they failed her in every possible way. Because of this lack of protection, Rachel was unable to defend herself or escape when the operation went wrong. When Green and Bradshaw became suspicious of her, they took her to a remote area where they realized she was working with the police. Rachel was executed, shot multiple times, and left in a ditch. By the time the police realized they had lost contact with her and began searching, it was far too late. This glaring lack of protection wasn't just negligence, it was outright incompetence. Rachel Hoffman was not a trained undercover officer. She was a 23-year-old civilian who should never have been put in such a dangerous position in the first place. The TPD's failures, from poor planning to insufficient surveillance to the lack of emergency protocols, directly contributed to her death. Her case is a tragic example of what happens when law enforcement prioritizes their goals over the safety and lives of the people they are supposed to protect. The mission to use Rachel Hoffman as a confidential informant was fundamentally flawed from its inception and disastrously mismanaged at every stage. It started with poor planning, continued with critical oversights during the operation itself, and ended in the tragic death of a young woman who should never have been involved in such a high-risk situation in the first place. This was not just a failure of execution, it was a complete breakdown of law enforcement responsibility. The sting operation called for Rachel to meet two suspected drug dealers, Andrea Green and Danilo Bradshaw, to purchase $13,000 worth of drugs and a firearm. This transaction was far beyond the scope of anything Rachel had ever encountered. She wasn't part of the criminal underworld, had no experience dealing with hardened criminals, and had never participated in anything remotely resembling an undercover operation. Yet, despite her inexperience, the Tallahassee Police Department, TPD, entrusted her with a high-stakes mission that required a level of expertise she simply didn't have. The planning of the operation itself was reckless and poorly thought out. There was no detailed contingency plan, no safety net for Rachel, and no protocol for how officers would handle deviations from the original meeting location. Instead of having officers closely monitor her every move, they stationed themselves too far away to respond in real time. The entire setup seemed designed to minimize police risk while leaving Rachel completely exposed. When Rachel met with Green and Bradshaw, the first sign of trouble emerged almost immediately. The The suspects decided to change the meeting location. This should have been an immediate red flag for the officers monitoring the sting. A location change is a well-known tactic among criminals to test whether they're being followed or set up. It's a warning sign that the operation may be compromised, and any experienced law enforcement team would know that such a development significantly increases the risk to the informant. Yet despite this, the officers did not intervene or call off the operation. Rachel, following the suspects' instructions, drove them to a remote rural area. At this point, the situation had spiraled far beyond the officers' control. Rachel's wire, which was placed in her purse rather than on her body, began to lose signal. Audio from the wire became intermittent, making it difficult for officers to monitor the conversation or understand what was happening. Worse still, the officers were not tailing Rachel's car closely enough to know her exact location. They lost track of her entirely when she left the original meeting site. As Rachel drove further into the secluded area, she was left completely alone with two armed and increasingly suspicious criminals. Green and Bradshaw, realizing something was off, began to suspect Rachel was working with law enforcement. Without any backup nearby and no way to signal for help, Rachel was at their mercy. The TPD's failure to maintain close surveillance or have a quick response team nearby left her stranded in an incredibly dangerous situation. The suspect's suspicions were soon confirmed. Once they realized Rachel was cooperating with the police, they executed her in cold blood. She was shot multiple times and left in a ditch. The $13,000 in cash provided by the police was stolen, along with Rachel's belongings. By the time law enforcement finally located her body, it was far too late to save her. This botched mission exposed numerous failures in how the operation was handled. The officers' lack of preparation, their inability to adapt to the situation as it unfolded, and their poor decision-making all contributed to Rachel's death. Basic safety measures, such as providing Rachel with a panic button, closely tailing her car, or having a team ready to extract her at the first sign of trouble, were either absent or ignored. Even after the suspects changed the location, a clear indication that the operation was compromised, the police continued to push forward rather than aborting the mission. In hindsight, it's clear that Rachel should never have been involved in such a dangerous operation to begin with. She was a civilian with no training or expertise, thrust into a high-stakes sting that required skills far beyond her capabilities. The TPD's decision to use her as a confidential informant in this capacity was irresponsible and ultimately fatal. The mission was not just poorly executed, it was doomed from the start. The TPD's overconfidence in their plan, coupled with their failure to protect Rachel at every step of the operation, led to a catastrophic outcome. Her death was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was the result of a series of reckless and negligent decisions by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Rachel's case has since become a stark reminder of how dangerous and flawed the use of confidential informants can be, especially when law enforcement prioritizes their objectives over the safety of those they recruit. As the sting operation began to unravel, one of the most critical failures was the police's inability to maintain contact with Rachel Hoffman. This breakdown in communication and monitoring proved to be a fatal misstep in an already poorly executed plan. From the moment Rachel left the initial meeting point with Andrea Green and Danilo Bradshaw, the Tallahassee Police Department, TPD, lost control of the situation, leaving Rachel isolated and vulnerable with no backup or immediate intervention possible. The problem started when Green and Bradshaw deviated from the agreed-upon meeting location. Instead of conducting the transaction at the prearranged spot, the suspects instructed Rachel to drive them to a new, remote location outside of Tallahassee. This sudden change in plans should have triggered immediate concern. A location change in a sting operation is a clear warning sign that something is amiss. Criminals often use this tactic to throw off potential law enforcement surveillance or confirm suspicions about informants. Despite the significant escalation in risk, the officers overseeing the operation failed to intervene, allowing Rachel to proceed into the unknown with two dangerous individuals. As Rachel drove to the new location, the TPD's surveillance began to falter. The wire hidden in Rachel's purse, intended to capture audio from the transaction, was an inadequate tool for tracking her movements or understanding the rapidly changing situation. The device suffered from poor placement and technical limitations. Since it was in her purse rather than on her body, the audio feed became inconsistent, with significant gaps in transmission whenever Rachel moved or shifted her bag. This meant that the officers listening in could only hear fragments of what was happening, leaving them with an incomplete and unreliable picture of the events unfolding. Making matters worse, the police failed to maintain close physical surveillance of Rachel's vehicle. Instead of tailing her car at a safe but manageable distance, the officers stationed themselves too far away to effectively monitor her movements. This decision left them unable to follow Rachel when the suspects directed her to a new, unfamiliar area. By the time the officers realized they had lost sight of her vehicle, Rachel was already miles away, driving deeper into rural Florida with two armed men who were becoming increasingly suspicious of her. The lack of real-time tracking or communication further compounded the situation. Rachel's car wasn't outfitted with a GPS tracker, a basic precaution that could have allowed law enforcement to pinpoint her exact location when she left the original meeting site. Without this technology, the officers had no way of knowing where she was headed. As the minutes passed and Rachel's car disappeared from view, the TPD's ability to provide any sort of meaningful support or backup vanished entirely. As Rachel drove further into the remote area, the listening device became even less effective. The intermittent audio feed left officers unable to assess the suspect's behavior or detect warning signs that Rachel's cover had been blown. So while the both Green and Bradshaw, growing increasingly suspicious, were likely testing Rachel to determine if she was working with law enforcement, by the time the police realized they had lost contact with her, Rachel was completely on her own, with no way to signal for help or call off the operation. This total breakdown in communication and surveillance left Rachel stranded in a life-threatening situation. When Green and Bradshaw finally confirmed their suspicions, they acted swiftly and brutally. Rachel was executed, shot multiple times, and left in a ditch. The $13,000 in cash and her belongings were stolen. It wasn't until hours later, after frantic attempts to reestablish contact, that the police began to understand the gravity of their failure. By then, it was far too late to save Rachel. The TPD's inability to maintain contact with Rachel was a critical failure that highlighted the reckless and unprofessional nature of the entire operation. Basic precautions, such as equipping Rachel with a GPS tracker, maintaining a closer tail on her car, or placing officers at key checkpoints could have prevented the situation from escalating to such a tragic outcome. Even the placement of the listening device showed a lack of foresight, as it rendered the police effectively blind when they needed information the most. Losing contact with Rachel wasn't just a technical oversight, it was emblematic of a larger systemic failure. One of the many misdirections that was planned for the mission was to carry Rachel out with people in masks, so while reappearing, she was not detained. The officers involved in the operation failed to anticipate the risks, failed to prepare for contingencies, and failed to prioritize the safety of the young woman they had coerced into cooperating with them. Rachel's life depended on their ability to monitor and protect her, and they failed her in every possible way. This loss of contact sealed Rachel's fate, leaving her alone and defenseless in the final, terrifying moments of her life. Her death stands as a devastating reminder of the consequences of poor planning and negligence in law enforcement operations. Rachel Hoffman's murder was a devastating and senseless act that occurred after a series of failures in the sting operation that had been set up to capture dangerous criminals. Once Rachel had been separated from law enforcement, the situation took a brutal turn. The suspects, Andrea Green and Danilo Bradshaw, had grown increasingly suspicious of her motives throughout the operation. They eventually realized that she was not the unsuspecting drug buyer she appeared to be, but instead an informant working with the police. What happened next was nothing short of a tragedy, and it unfolded in a manner that left Rachel with no chance of survival. After losing contact with Rachel and failing to maintain proper surveillance of the sting, the Tallahassee Police Department, TPD, was unaware of the danger Rachel was in when she was driven to a remote area by Green and Bradshaw. The two suspects became certain that she was working with law enforcement, and in that moment, they made a fateful decision that would end her life. Green and Bradshaw's suspicions were quickly confirmed, and the change in their behavior was noticeable. They likely confronted Rachel, demanding the truth about who she was and why she was there. Feeling cornered and betrayed by the woman they thought was their buyer, the two criminals decided to take drastic action to ensure that she could not identify them to the authorities. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It was a calculated, cold-blooded decision. The stakes were high, and they saw Rachel as a threat that needed to be eliminated. What happened next was a brutal execution. With no way to defend herself, Rachel was shot multiple times, leaving her body lifeless in a ditch. The suspects stole her belongings, including the $13,000 in cash she had been given by law enforcement as part of the sting operation, as well as her purse and personal items. In one violent act, her life was ended, and the law enforcement officials who were supposed to protect her had failed to do so in every conceivable way. The murder was not a random or chaotic act of violence. It was an execution, a deliberate and premeditated act carried out by two criminals who felt they had no other option. They knew they could get away with it, as they were aware of the police's lack of control over the situation. The fact that they executed Rachel in such a cold, calculated way speaks volumes about the risks she faced and how utterly unprepared the TPD was to prevent such a tragedy. Getting to the police and to Port Police was not a guarantee of their safety, and they should have had one. When the officers finally realized that they had lost contact with Rachel and began to search for her, they were horrified to discover that she was already dead. The search had taken hours, and by the time her body was found, it was too late. Law enforcement's failure to act quickly or intervene when they lost contact with her meant that they had lost the opportunity to save her life. The tragic murder of Rachel Hoffman was a direct result of their reckless handling of the operation, their lack of oversight, and their failure to prioritize her safety over the completion of the sting. Rachel's murder was a painful and poignant reminder of the risks involved when confidential informants are used in law enforcement operations. When they are put in dangerous situations without proper training, protection, or support, the consequences can be devastating. Rachel's death could have been prevented if the TPD had acted with more caution, more foresight, and more care for her well-being. Instead, she was left to face armed criminals alone, with no one to protect her when she needed it most. Her death was not just a tragic consequence of one bad operation. It was a senseless loss of life that could have been avoided with the proper safeguards in place. The public's reaction to Rachel Hoffman's tragic murder was one of intense outrage and disbelief. The news that a young woman, a civilian with no law enforcement training, had been left alone and vulnerable during a dangerous drug sting operation sparked widespread anger, not only at the criminals involved, but also at the police department responsible for her safety. Rachel's death illuminated deep flaws in how law enforcement handled undercover operations, and many felt that her death was entirely preventable. In the days following Rachel's murder, local media outlets were flooded with reports that highlighted the stark failures of the Tallahassee Police Department, TPD, in executing the sting operation. The fact that a civilian like Rachel had been thrust into such a dangerous scenario with inadequate training, protection, or surveillance seemed incomprehensible to many. How could law enforcement allow such a catastrophic lapse in judgment to happen? The public struggled to reconcile the notion of a police department that was supposed to protect citizens with the devastating outcome of the operation. Rachel's family, friends, and the broader community felt not just sorrow, but a profound sense of betrayal. Rachel had been a college graduate, someone with a bright future ahead of her. She was recruited into the sting operation by the police, who promised to protect her, yet from the moment the operation began, her safety seemed to take a backseat to the police's desire to make a drug bust. Her parents, particularly her mother, expressed their heartbreak and disbelief at how their daughter had been treated. They felt that Rachel's death was not just a tragic accident, but a consequence of poor judgment, negligence, and disregard for her well-being. As the details of the operation were made public, questions began to emerge about how such a flawed and poorly managed plan could have been approved in the first place. Many people began to wonder why Rachel had been chosen to participate in the sting. She had no history with law enforcement, no training in undercover operations, and no experience in dealing with dangerous criminals. Why was she put in such a high-risk situation with no adequate backup or safety protocols? These questions stirred an outpouring of public anger as it became clear that Rachel had been put in harm's way without sufficient consideration for her life. The loss of Rachel Hoffman became a rallying point for discussions about police accountability, transparency, and the treatment of confidential informants. Advocacy groups for victims' rights, as well as those focused on law enforcement reform, used Rachel's case to shine a spotlight on how police departments often misuse or neglect the safety of informants, especially when they are civilians with no training. Rachel's murder was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a broader systemic issue within law enforcement, one where the well-being of civilians is sometimes treated as secondary to the goals of the operation. Now, in the wake of Rachel's death, public outcry also led to calls for changes in how confidential informants are handled. Many people demanded greater oversight and stricter regulations around the use of informants in sting operations, especially when those informants are not professionals or trained officers. There was a growing belief that the safety of informants should be paramount in any operation, and that law enforcement should have more stringent protocols in place to protect them, particularly when they are working in high-risk situations. The fact that Rachel was left without protection, no backup, and no way to signal for help when things went wrong was seen as a critical failure of the police, one that could have been prevented with proper planning and care. The public's outrage was not just confined to those directly affected by Rachel's death. It resonated with many who saw the flaws in the system and recognized that her death could have happened to anyone. People across the country began to question the priorities of law enforcement, particularly in terms of their treatment of vulnerable individuals who are recruited to help in criminal investigations. Was the pursuit of criminals worth more than the safety of a young woman, an untrained civilian who had been caught in a deadly game of law enforcement strategy? Many argued that no operation, no matter how important, should ever place an informant in a situation where their life is at such high risk. This public outrage eventually sparked demands for accountability. The Tallahassee Police Department came under intense scrutiny, with calls for a full investigation into the operation and the decisions that led to Rachel's death. Local officials were pressured to reassess how sting operations were conducted and to put new measures in place to ensure that something like this would never happen again. In the aftermath of Rachel's murder, the public's demand for transparency and justice became a powerful force, calling for law enforcement to take responsibility for their failures and make meaningful changes to prevent future tragedies. The pain of Rachel's family, friends, and the community at large was compounded by the sense that her death had been entirely avoidable. Her murder, while heartbreaking, also became a pivotal moment in the ongoing conversation about police reform and the protection of confidential informants in law enforcement operations. In the aftermath of Rachel Hoffman's tragic murder, the public outrage and pressure on law enforcement led to significant changes in the way law enforcement handles confidential informants, especially those who were untrained civilians. Rachel's death became a catalyst for legislative action, leading to the creation of Rachel's Law, a new set of regulations designed to ensure greater safety and accountability in operations that involve confidential informants. Rachel's Law was born out of the realization that what happened to Rachel could, and likely would, happen again unless meaningful changes were implemented within law enforcement practices. Her tragic death highlighted glaring deficiencies in how the police use civilians in high-risk operations, especially in cases involving drug busts or other dangerous criminal activities. The law aimed to address these issues by imposing stricter guidelines on the recruitment, management, and protection of confidential informants, particularly those who lacked experience and training in law enforcement operations. One of the key components of Rachel's Law was the introduction of stricter safety protocols for confidential informants. Prior to Rachel's death, informants were often sent into risky situations without adequate protection or resources. Law enforcement agencies were expected to make sure that informants were monitored closely throughout the operation, with a dedicated response team ready to intervene at a moment's notice. Under Rachel's Law, any operation involving an informant now had to include clear, enforceable safety measures. These included ensuring that informants were equipped with tracking devices like GPS units, and that they were never left alone in high-risk situations without constant supervision. Another critical aspect of Rachel's Law was the requirement for more thorough vetting and training for confidential informants. One of the glaring failures in Rachel's case was that she had no training or preparation for the danger she was walking into. She was a civilian with no history of involvement in criminal activity, and yet she was thrust into a high-risk operation with little more than a brief on how to interact with suspects. The law mandated that law enforcement agencies provide proper training for anyone recruited as an informant, ensuring that they understood the risks involved and were equipped to handle the situations they would face. Training would include situational awareness, understanding when to back out of dangerous situations, and how to communicate with handlers during an operation. In addition, Rachel's Law placed a heavy emphasis on accountability. Law enforcement agencies were now required to document and justify the decision to use an informant in a given operation. This documentation would include an assessment of the risks involved and the specific protections that would be in place to safeguard the informant. It was designed to prevent agencies from rushing into operations without considering the well-being of the people they recruited. The law also stipulated that there be independent oversight of sting operations involving informants, ensuring that there was an unbiased review of every case where an informant's safety was at risk. Perhaps most importantly, Rachel's Law established a formal procedure for immediately halting operations if an informant's safety was jeopardized. In Rachel's case, the failure to respond when the location was changed and the loss of contact with her led to disastrous consequences. Under the new regulations, if an operation became compromised or an informant was in immediate danger, officers would be required to act swiftly to stop the mission and extract the informant, no questions asked. This provision aimed to prevent any more tragedies like Rachel's, where law enforcement's fixation on completing the operation led them to ignore the risks to the informant's life. Rachel's Law was not just a set of rules. It was a direct response to the failure of the police to protect a vulnerable young woman who was acting at their request. It aimed to fix the system that had allowed Rachel to be exposed to unimaginable danger without proper safeguards in place. The law sought to make sure that no other informant would ever be placed in a situation where their safety was an afterthought. In the years following the introduction of Rachel's Law, law enforcement agencies across the country were forced to reevaluate how they engaged with confidential informants. While it did not undo the heartbreak caused by Rachel's death, the law became a symbol of the need for reform and a reminder that those who risk their lives to assist the police in fighting crime should be treated with the utmost care and respect. The hope was that Rachel's story and the law that was named in her honor would prevent future tragedies and ensure that no more lives were lost due to a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable participants. Through Rachel's Law, the legacy of a young woman who tragically lost her life in the line of duty became a force for positive change in law enforcement practices. It set a precedent for how confidential informants should be treated, ensuring that the safety of individuals is never sacrificed in the name of an operation's success. The law stands as a solemn reminder of the importance of oversight, planning, and protection, and as a promise that Rachel's death was not in vain. The legacy of Rachel Hoffman is marked not only by the tragic circumstances of her death, but by the powerful advocacy that followed, which ultimately reshaped policies and practices surrounding the use of confidential informants. Her death was a catalyst for change, not just within law enforcement, but also in the way society understands the risks faced by civilians who are recruited into dangerous undercover operations. Rachel's legacy, therefore, extends far beyond her tragic end. It is woven into the fabric of advocacy for greater accountability, safety, and transparency in law enforcement. After Rachel's death, her parents, especially her mother, became staunch advocates for reform. They used their personal grief as a platform to speak out against the systemic failures that led to their daughter's murder. They tirelessly campaigned for the creation of new laws that would protect informants like Rachel who, despite her good intentions and willingness to help, were often placed in harm's way with little regard for their safety. Through their efforts, they were able to bring the conversation about informant safety to the forefront of public discourse, ensuring that Rachel's death was not forgotten, but instead used as a driving force for reform. Rachel's parents worked alongside lawmakers, law enforcement officials, and advocacy groups to ensure that no other family would experience the same heartbreak. Their advocacy contributed directly to the introduction of Rachel's Law, which instituted stricter regulations around the recruitment, management, and protection of informants. The law set new standards for how police departments would be required to treat informants, focusing particularly on those who were untrained civilians. These efforts were a significant part of Rachel's legacy, as her parents' commitment to justice turned their profound loss into a force for positive change. Beyond the legislative changes, Rachel's story also sparked a broader conversation about police accountability and the treatment of informants in law enforcement operations. The public outcry that followed her death revealed deep concerns about how law enforcement agencies had been conducting sting operations and using civilians as informants. People began to ask difficult questions about whether the police had truly prioritized Rachel's safety or if she had been treated as expendable for the sake of completing a drug bust. This public scrutiny and the subsequent push for reform challenged police departments to examine their practices more closely, fostering a climate of increased transparency. Rachel's legacy also inspired other families who had lost loved ones in similar circumstances to speak out and demand changes in law enforcement procedures. By standing up and telling their stories, these families joined in the movement for reform, amplifying the call for better protections for confidential informants. The collective voice of these families, bolstered by Rachel's own story, pushed for systemic changes that would help ensure that no more lives would be unnecessarily endangered in the name of law enforcement operations. In addition to the policy changes, Rachel's legacy also lives on through the organizations and foundations that were established in her memory. These organizations focus on advocacy for victims of crime, law enforcement reform, and the protection of confidential informants. Through these platforms, Rachel's story continues to be told, serving as a reminder of the importance of humanizing law enforcement practices and ensuring that civilians who work with the police are treated with the respect and protection they deserve. Her legacy is also carried forward by those in law enforcement who recognize the failures of the past and who are committed to ensuring that future operations prioritize the safety and well-being of all involved. In some police departments, Rachel's case has been used as a training tool to teach officers the importance of protecting informants and avoiding the mistakes that led to her death. Through this education, new generations of law enforcement officers are being reminded of the critical need for caution, oversight, and care when handling confidential informants. Rachel's story serves as a cautionary tale, but also as a beacon of hope for reform. Her tragic death illuminated the dangers and flaws in the system, but it also sparked the necessary conversations and actions that have led to tangible changes. While Rachel's life was cut short, her advocacy and the reforms that followed have ensured that her death was not in vain. Today, thanks to the tireless efforts of her family, advocacy groups, and lawmakers, Rachel's legacy continues to influence law enforcement practices, making the world safer for future confidential informants and serving as a testament to the resilience of those who fight for justice, even after the most devastating loss. Rachel Hoffman's story is one of heartbreak, but also of transformation. The profound loss of a young woman with a bright future ahead of her served as a catalyst for critical change in law enforcement practices. Her tragic death exposed the flaws in how confidential informants were used and the failures of a system that should have protected her. Yet from that pain and loss, a powerful advocacy movement arose, one that pushed for reforms that would ensure no one else would face the same fate. Moody's Law and the awareness it raised about the need for greater accountability and safety in sting operations stand as a testament to the power of action in the wake of tragedy. Though nothing can bring Rachel back, her legacy continues to shape the policies and practices that protect those who help law enforcement. It serves as a reminder that we must always prioritize human life, that we must learn from our mistakes, and that through advocacy and collective action, change is possible. Rachel's story is one of lost potential, but it is also one of hope. Hope that the future will be different for the men and women who come forward to work with law enforcement, that they will be treated with the care, respect, and protection they deserve. And, above all, it is a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable loss, we have the power to make sure that no tragedy is ever forgotten and that change, however slow, can be achieved.